Okay, so good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining the Kanban Coaching Exchange. Like I said, it's fantastic to see so many people from around the globe, a truly global community. And I think it's fantastic that we can now bring great speakers like Patrick, who you might have not have had the opportunity to see in your local area, we can now bring to that online environment. I also just want to say thank you to Simon Machin, who has dialed in this evening. He actually sponsors our Zoom link, which makes it possible for us to have over 100 people come to these sessions. So just thank you so much for your sponsorship throughout the year. We really definitely appreciate that. So I'm really honoured to have our speaker tonight. Patrick is an absolute legend in the upstream Kanban world and just generally in Kanban. So he's a founder of Okaloa Flow Lab with a lady called Arlette, which is a visualized game that we play to help teach principles and practices of Kanban and flow. He's also the author of the Upstream Kanban book, so definitely worthwhile going to the website, which I'll pop into the chat window later, and downloading that book if it's not something that you've already done. There's a free version online. Patrick is also a Brickell Key Award winner, and if that's the first time you've heard that, it was an award that we used to do within the Kanban industry that recognised people for their significant contribution to Kanban industry and growth and learning, and so we would annually award that for that contribution. I think Ian Cowell has also won, so we've got two of these people here tonight, so we are honoured. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over, Patrick. He's the reason you're here, not me. So I'm going to hand it over, Patrick. Take it away.
Thanks. So Ellen mentioned Arlette, so she's, as always, in the neighborhood, listening in. So when Ellen asked me to talk about something, and then she mentioned upstream, so I was very glad to accept to talk about something, but then something about upstream, but something very different than what I'm used to talk when I'm talking about upstream. So the recent months, as for many of us, have been very exceptional, and that exceptional thing is kind of the reason for my talk here. We started a couple of years back with Okaloa Flow Lab, but that what we started with is the result of a journey into Agile. So we started way earlier, and the recent months have been for us an acceleration in our thinking in terms of that journey into Agile. And I said to Helen, this is something that is close to my heart today, and this is something that I really want to talk about. And I think this is something worthwhile to share. So it's a personal journey. It is a personal journey, but I think it's the concepts that we will be covering are quite interesting for everybody. I will leave at certain places in the presentation. I will leave room for questions. So I'm not going to talk, and then let you ask questions. But rather I'll every 6 or 7 slides or so there's room for questions. So use the chat if you have questions, and then at that point we can answer them. Okay. So as I said, this is a personal journey. So my involvement in Agile goes way back, end of the 90s. So I'll start there. As an early days Agile practitioner, there was a certain turning point at 2004. Maybe that date rings a bell to you. Then I became a method instructor, a Kanban method instructor. And then more recently, there was another turning point for us. with the introduction of FlowLab. And I think today we're yet at another turning point, which I think is interesting for many of us. Before I start, what I want to say again also about myself is that I'm a divided mind. Now I'm referring here, the reference is not on the slide, but I'll make sure in the slides that are going to be published that reference is in there. But I'm referring here to Jonathan Hyatt. So I'm a divided mind in the sense that my career started as in academia, and so I'm not unfamiliar with very rational reasoning that has been trained very well while I was working in university. And so I'm not afraid of rational reasoning and even quite complex models. At the same time, I'm a practitioner. From early days, agile practitioners, I've led development teams, and that has developed a certain intuition, and sometimes these two collide. And as many people, which is only human, it's hard to, although I'm very familiar with rational reasoning, it's hard to reason yourself into new behavior. So that's a little bit about me. Now, if you're coming from a Kanban background, you recognize this model not as the rider in the elephant and the rational and the intuitive brain, but maybe as system 1 and system 2, right? Now, going back to the journey. So my involvement with Agile started when Arlet started a development company, a software product development company, and we jumped into this very early on as a group of very young people, and we were through my connections with the university. I got hold of Ken Beck, who was in Europe at the time, and we started to do extreme programming. So this is end of the 90s. This was with a group of let's say 20 to 30 developers. So early on, we started to do extreme programming, and through that, and because I also was present at many of the UPSLA conferences where a lot of the agile ideas were born. So we got involved in the agile thinking quite early. Now, what struck me about XP at that time, and this might be colored a little bit by hindsight, what struck me about XP in that time is how those practices really fit together. On the slide, I put this quote from the first edition of Ken Beck's book, who says, like, any one of these practices doesn't stand well on its own, but they require the other practices to keep them in balance. So in other words, if you take each of these practices in isolation, they might not be very good ideas. They might not be very good practices. But when you combine them, they keep themselves in balance. So what is bad, what is a deficiency in one, becomes in the presence of another practice, it becomes actually an something good. Yeah. And that really, when I first opened the book from Ken Beck, this really struck me, like how those practices fit together. But more importantly, and this might be colored by hindsight a little bit, more importantly, how the meaning of each of these practices changes when you put them in the context of the other practices. If you take the example of refactoring, just changing your code in itself might not be a good idea, but if you put it into the context of test-driven development, they balance each other out. So the meaning really changes, and that's something that struck me. When with extreme programming. Now, we not only got inspired by extreme programming, we got inspired by a lot of things at that time, right? I was involved in. I did some work at the university in Bern while I was still like at the university, and the professor in Bern did something very strange. We had a daily stand-up, which I didn't recognize as a daily stand-up at that time, where we said what we've been doing, what we were going to do, and what obstacles we encountered. And so through that, we got to know things about Scrum, but also through our connections with a lady called Adele Goldberg, we got involved. We got to know the work of Jim Highsmith on adaptive software development, and we got inspired by all these different things. Just like there was no for us. It was really an ecosystem. There was no clear. We talked about maybe we talked about methods, but there was no such notion of these really strict boundaries between methods. There was no identity formed around those methods yet. So for me, if I think back about at that time, for me this was really a place of practice. Yeah, it was a place, and the OOPS conferences were very exemplary for that. It was a place where you just had multiple practitioners, each discovering their own things, each discovering their own new ways of working, and developing their own new ways of thinking, and then sharing those ways of working without those strict boundaries. It was really a place where everybody discovered, and there was a lot of sharing in terms of new ways of working. So that's how I remember it. Again, it might be colored by time, but that's how I remember this. Really a place of practice. Now the inflection point. The inflection point for me for that is the Agile Manifesto. So the Agile Manifesto is a testimony of that place of practice. In the sense that you had all those people coming together, and they all came from a different background. They all had their own little thing, but still they came together to write up this manifesto. And the start of the manifesto says, "We are uncovering better ways." For me, that's really a testimony of this is a place of practice. They were all sharing, they're all uncovering better ways, and they find it useful to put their heads together and across all that diversity to come up with one statement. Yeah. So I think that's a testimony of that place of practice. But it's also an inflection point. Yeah, it's also a turning point, in the sense that this also kicked off Agile, not just as a place of practice, but it also kicked off Agile as a school of thought. Because now we have a manifesto, we have a document that represents a shared common belief between all those practitioners, which was the basis of an identity formed around this Agile thing, right? So we have a manifesto that is a testimony of a group of people that have a shared belief and a shared set of practices. Yeah. So while the manifesto is a testimony of this place of practice where it's all about openness, sharing, community, yeah, we now have that same manifesto that is an inflection point, a turning point that kicked off Agile as a school of thought. And it didn't not only kicked off Agile as a school of thought, it kicked off many schools of thought, many different factions, many different sub-schools of thought. So it was kind of the starting point of all these many schools of thought, with their own beliefs and their own identity. Yeah. So it's a strange point in time for me, where on the one hand it's a testimony of this place of practice, but at the same time it's a kickoff of this notion of a school of thought. So for me, that was really an inflection point. It was a turning point, and it also was, for me personally, it was a turning point in the sense that I disconnected a little bit from the Agile community for a couple of years because I didn't feel comfortable. I didn't feel comfortable with that turning point. So I promised to leave some time for questions. This is a good point for questions if you have any. If not,
What made you want to leave or take a break?
Yeah. I was quite familiar with extreme programming. Now, extreme programming didn't really kept on developing, I think, as a place of practice. Less had the characteristics of a real school of thought. Scrum became the dominant school of thought, and I didn't feel comfortable in terms of teaching Scrum, coaching Scrum. I didn't feel comfortable with it. Maybe because with Scrum I was quite late, and I didn't have that same feeling of the place of practice. Maybe because of that, but I didn't really feel comfortable with it. And not because of Scrum, but maybe more because I was late in terms of joining that community, or didn't really connect with that community well enough.
And on one of your slides, you had something about lean development. You know, where you had Crystal and XP and stuff.
Yeah.
What did you mean on that slide by lean dev?
So this was, I think. So the things that are on the slide are actually so Jim Highsmith wrote this book, and I think again that's a testimony of this place of practice, Agile software development's ecosystems, and the reference to lean development is the reference to the work of Mary and Tom Poppendieck, as far as I can recollect.
Okay, got it. Thanks.
Okay, cool. So inflection points towards a school of thought. So one of the schools of thought that developed, but it started out, I think, really as a place of practice, where I reconnected is the Kanban place of practice, the Kanban school of thought. So I reconnected with that. I found out about Kanban around 2008, 2009, I think. Some early blog posts, and I could reconnect with that because it spoke very much to my rational brain in terms of having some underlying theory, and so that really spoke to my rational brain. And also, if you look at the early days, I think Kanban also started as really a school of practice. So the group of people early on was quite eclectic, quite a diverse group of people, a lot of divergent ideas, different ideas, and people very willing to share. So people discovering. So again, that atmosphere of a place of practice. Now, that also quite rapidly turned into to a school of thought. People started codifying and especially under the guidance of David Anderson, people started codifying Kanban into the Kanban method, and I did my contribution to that with upstream Kanban. It started to become more of a codified methodology. Yeah. So moving from this place of practice where sharing is going on, things started to get codified, and the Kanban method emerged out of that. Kanban became more of a, especially with the Kanban method, Kanban became more of a school of thought. What do I mean by that? And it really became a very strong school of thought, right? A very strong school of thought. What I mean by that is, just like this school of thought that was kicked off by the manifesto, it's a group of people that have an identity that is based on a shared common belief, common beliefs in the principles and practices of the Kanban method. But that belief is codified into a doctrine. That's why we call it the Kanban method, and the codification of practices, principles, values that also develops into an orthodoxy. Now, I know that this word orthodoxy might sound a little bit negative, but I'm not implying it in a negative way. I think it's just a common set of beliefs, and in terms of people that believe, that doctrine, that codified doctrine is a kind of like the manifesto. It's kind of a manifesto that we all the people in the Kanban community can adhere to. Now that school of thought is based on a couple of assumptions. One assumption is that knowledge about new ways of working can be codified into reusable models. The knowledge, the experience that the early people that were experimenting with Kanban that they discovered and that they uncovered that new way of working. The assumption is that knowledge could be codified into the Kanban method, so that there's some kind of uniformity across all those experiences. There's also an implicit assumption that these are very rational models, and that the change and the learning that goes on is driven by rational individuals. There's a lot of focus on the individual, although essentially in the Kanban method we talk a lot about the organization, but the change oftentimes relies on individuals, acts of leadership at all levels of the organization. Now, there's an implicit assumption that the practices interact, but that interaction does not change their nature, unlike with XP. So it's very analytical, and it's based on an assumption that that codification that creates value, and that as such we can interpret these models as intellectual property that can be economically exploited. So that's, for me, that's what is typical about a school of thought, and I think the Kanban method fits that bill in terms of being, in this case, a very strong school of thought. Now, there's a lot of focus on codification, on rational reasoning, a lot of focus on measurement, rational reasoning. And so the way we, and this picture is, for me, has a lot of meaning. and maybe for a lot of the Kanban people in the room, this picture has a lot of meaning in the sense that the way we teach Kanban, this picture can sometimes plays a very central role in terms of it depicts the fact that we should limit things. We should limit work in progress. And oftentimes that picture is used when we train Kanban or when we teach Kanban, saying, you know, if we all make individual rational decisions to go on the highway, the global result is that nobody moves. Yeah. And so it's a picture that shows that the limits of having rational individuals rationally making decisions, because if we each do that decision on our own, in the end, the highways, everybody on the highway is standing still. And oftentimes we use that to rationally explain why limiting work in progress is a good idea. Yeah. Now, there's quite some irony, I think, in that picture, in the sense that we use that picture to show that on the one hand, if we all make that rational decision individually, it's not a good idea. But oftentimes we use that picture to rationally explain to people why limiting WIP is a very good idea. Now, I often used also that picture in my own Kanban trainings, and I did a lot of effort in trying to rationally explain to people why the focus on overutilizing resources is not a good idea, and that we should be limiting WIP. And the more I started rationalizing it, the more I saw that people disconnected. In the end, maybe rationally people might say yes, yes, yes to me, saying yeah, we understand. But then that didn't translate into other behavior. Yeah. Now, this was an experience that that was not unique to me, and so I saw that other trainers struggled with that, and so that was another turning point for myself. Approximately around October 2016, we started thinking about this, and a workshop by Mike Burrows actually opened my eyes, where he showed that through simulation, so rather than rationally explaining things, through simulation, you could explain quite soffisticated concepts in a way that was much more powerful, and which was more sticky with people than through this rational explanation. So that for us was the starting point for, rather than using rational explanations of Kanban, the starting point of using simulation to allow people to experience alternative ways of working, new ways of working, to experience them without having to explain them, so that people could come to their own conclusions. So that was, for me, that was really a turning point, that insight. So rather than really talking to the rational brain, we started talking to the intuitive brain. As I said, it's very hard to rationalize yourself into new behavior, and so we started seeing the power of providing people new experiences, different experiences, allowing people to analyze those experiences, and then coming to their own conclusions in terms of that analysis. And so that was the birth for us of Okalawa Flow Lab. So this was a new start, a start where learning started from people having an experience with their current way of working, seeing the limitations of that. Typically a way of working where there's lots of emphasis on resource efficiency, and then translating that into a way of working that that creates more flow. What we started seeing is one thing is that this created some deeper learning than what we were used to. People started understanding Kanban in a way that that we hadn't seen before, and also it was more sticky. It also was more mobilizing, and what we started seeing through all the workshops that we did is that the less we said people what to do, the more people came back. So we started seeing that there is value in terms of training people, not by telling them what to do, not by imposing a certain model of thinking, which is more the way of what you would do in an when you are starting from this rational idea in the school of thought, but not imposing a certain model onto people, but rather allowing people to develop their own model of thinking. Not in projecting your experiences onto people, but rather allowing people to develop their own, to reorganize their own experiences. So we saw some deeper learning than what we were used to. Now, it started out as a Kanban simulation, but more and more, we also saw that the simulation was just simulation of work, and that the implications were broader than just Kanban. So we also started seeing a broader picture. So we started seeing the whole rather than just the parts. Now, I know that I need to be careful here, because my background is in Kanban, and my background is in flow, and I've got a lot of affinity with thinking about flow. But at the same time, you need to recognize that there's also other things like collaboration, like learning. And what we started seeing with the simulation is that just like with XP, with extreme programming, where you've got practices that each might have their own shortcomings, but if you put them together, they start to form a more powerful whole. And we started to see that also with the simulation. We started to see that the practice of limiting width must go hand in hand with collaboration, but it also must go hand in hand with learning. And so we started to see a bigger picture. At the same time, through using simulation in our coaching engagements, we started to see another type of change in the organizations that we were working with. Now, it's hard for me to rationally explain this. This is an experience. This is a feeling that we had. In terms of the groups of people that we were working with, they started to have a deeper learning. And the way we see that deeper learning is that people started to really talk about flow problems, collaboration problems, learning problems, irrespective of the methods that they were using. So people started focusing on really the problems that they were facing in their teams or their organization, and not so much in terms of the practices they were implementing. So for us, that's an indication that the learning that is being created is deeper. And our rationalization of that is that through the simulation, people clearly do not just learn by listening, clearly not. It's even more than learning by experience, but to a certain extent, the simulation is learning by co-creation. Each simulation is different, and the way the simulation runs oftentimes depends on the people that are in the room. So people are a big part of creating the simulation themselves. And for me, that's from our experience, that's when people have this aha moment, and that's when they really change their behavior. So a deeper form of learning. But also, it's more. We saw a more broader scope, going beyond the team level, just because we used simulations that were quite generic, so they speak very broad in the organization, not just IT or software development, but everybody in the organization, HR, marketing, executive management, everybody in the organization. So it goes broader in the organization. But also, obviously, because the simulations scale into the portfolio level, and so we could speak to a much broader part of the organization. Yeah. And to us, that's that gave us the feeling that in some of the organizations that we were working with, we really started seeing the beginnings of true transformational change. So for me, that's an example of the beginnings of a healthy place of practice. Yeah. So a place where practitioners meet. And the reason why they meet is to themselves uncover better ways of working. So not a model that is codified by somebody else, but a model that they're discovering themselves, develop their own ways of thinking, build a community, develop mastery. And contrary to the school of thought, it's based on the recognition that intuition plays a crucial role here. It's hard to reason yourself into new behavior, so it's not all rational. Intuition comes first. That learning and change is social. If we organize workshops, we always organize workshops, or we try to organize workshops where we invite the customer, where we invite the suppliers, where we invite part of management. Because we recognize that it is a social, there is a social aspect of to doing the simulation, and that learning is social. People learn as much by seeing the reactions of other people than by what they experience themselves. So it's a recognition that learning is social, and we need to take that into account. It's a recognition that ways of working differ from place to place, so that there's no one model, and that practices, and for me that's very important, practices take on a different meaning when they are put into relationship with other practices, just like with what we saw with XP. So practices of flow, practices of collaboration, practices of learning take on a different meaning when you put them together. So what a WIP limit represents is different for a team that has a very light level of collaboration and versus a team that has a very deep level of collaboration. The meaning of a WIP limit might change according to the other practices that are in the team. And then knowledge is not seen as an intellectual property, but it's seen as a common good that is freely shared. So this could be the endpoint this could be the end point of my presentation. Stopping here, and this would be the typical presentation. School of thought is bad. Place of practice is good. So that could be the end point, but it clearly is not. But before continuing, any questions?
I have a couple, but I'll wait until you you finish the presentation. I don't want to cannibalize all the time.
Okay. Shall I continue then?
Please do, Patrick.
Yeah. So the for us, what characterizes or what is our measure for success in terms of creating this healthy place of practice is this notion of traction. So when we purely focus on, if we purely focus on FlowLab as a product, then obviously as a product, what we want to do is get as many people on board, so acquire people, activate those people, and get results. And so that would be the typical push model to get something like our simulations into the market. Now, for us, that's a very linear type of model of thinking. We have a different measure of success. Our measure of success in terms of doing a simulation is not just whether we get results, but more importantly, whether people come back, whether at the end of the workshop somebody comes back and says, I want you to do this workshop with my team, or I want to actually co-facilitate with you the next workshop, or in terms of referral, saying, you know what, you need to do this with this other team, or you need to do this with our management. Yeah. So for us, the measure of success is not just getting results, especially not just a happiness score at the end of the training, but more whether people come back to the simulation, or whether they refer others to the simulation. So that is the notion of traction. Yeah, it is. If you look at change as kind of a factory, in the way that Ash Maurya talks about the customer factory. If you think about change as a factory, then the factory turns potential agents into actual change agents. Potential practitioners of your new way of working into actual practitioners of your new way of working. And traction is the rate at which you do that. Now, if you have retention and referral, that's clearly a non-linear boost to your traction. It's an exponential boost to your traction. So for us, the focus is really on that exponential boost. Do we create traction? Now, it appears to us that that traction is directly related to the way we facilitate the simulation, in the sense that our feeling is that the more we go into the simulation with an open mind, the less we impose a certain model of thinking onto people, and the more we let people explore their own model of thinking, the more people come back. Sometimes I cannot help it, and my rational brain goes into overdrive, and then I want to impose a certain model of thinking. I'm so convinced about Kanban, and then I want to impose Kanban onto the participants. Every time that I do so, I see that people come, this creates friction, and there's less chance that people come back to the workshop. Every time I'm going in there in a very perceptive way, and I don't try to impose my own model of thinking onto people. The more I do so, the less I impose my own model of thinking, the more people come back. So that's a way of facilitating the workshop. Traction is also related to the way you invite people. As I said, we try to invite not just a team, but also the customers to the team, the suppliers to the team, some of the management of the team, in order to enhance the traction, enhance the chance that some of those come back to you and say, I want you to do this also in this part of the organization, in my part of the organization. So there's many different ways that that you can create that traction. Now, traction also has a certain danger in it, in the sense that the more people are involved, the more you get into this problem of a social dilemma. Yeah. The more people are involved, the more people jump onto the bandwagon, the more chance that there is that you get people jumping on the bandwagon that are not as deeply familiar with what you want to teach and the way you want to teach it. The more chance that you have is that you have free riders jumping on the bandwagon. The more chance that you have that there's dilution. Yeah. The more chance, in our case, for example, the more chance that we have that people start using our simulation in a way that we did not intend. So that is a social dilemma. Yeah. It's a dilemma where, on the one hand, we've got people that really want to invest in their thinking, the providers, into how they use the simulation, into how deep their knowledge is of, let's say, Kanban, versus people that just try to capitalize on that and just try to use the simulation because it has a certain brand, because it has a certain aura, a certain it's associated with certain good things, and so the more traction that we get, the more we feel this social dilemma. Now, to overcome that social dilemma, we need to us the solution is to not start thinking in terms of polarization, to not start thinking in terms of school of good is good, place of practice is a good thing, school of good is school of thought is a bad thing. Yeah. So the more we see that social dilemma, the more we need to see the value of, if we say that diversity is good, if we say that in the place of practice diversity is good, then we also need to recognize that every one of these schools of thoughts brings with it their own ideas, brings with it their own valuable ideas, and that so while we see that there is lots of value in first experiencing and then providing the theory, in a more intuitive approach, there is also value in a rational approach. While there's value into having diversity, there's also value into having uniformity. There is value into having a shared model and a shared belief, but there's also value in having diversity. Yeah. So to our feeling, dealing with that social dilemma means that we need to build on on both the idea of having a place of practice, where it's all about sharing and experiencing and exploring, as well as this idea of a school of thought, where we try to bind people into a shared set of beliefs, develop a certain level of codify things, develop a certain level of doctrine. In our case, the way forward, and this is something we're working on every day, is to have a certain level of reciprocity. So on the one hand, it's good that people contribute, but then if people contribute, we need to recognize that and give credit to that, and more than credit. This should be beneficial for the people that are contributing, but at the same time, there's also people that are more of a transactional nature, that have a more transactional relation, that we have a more transactional relationship with, and so we need to be able to deal with those people also. And so the reciprocity in our case boils down to the fact that we work with people that are more in the sharing model. We try to also share with those people. People that are more in a transactional mode, we will work with those people also in a transactional mode. And so for us, that's the solution to that social dilemma. And then it ties back again to place of practice and school of thought. With people that are more of a sharing model, we see the knowledge that we create more as a common good. With people that are more in a transactional nature, we will look at knowledge more as from an IP standpoint, an intellectual property that needs to be protected. So we try to combine those two models into our place of practice. So that's for me what Okaloa Flow Lab is about, not just a simulation, but more a synthesis of, on the one hand, a place of practice for new ways of working. But this is the thing that we're using the simulation for, as a place in which people can practice new ways of working. But at the same time, we try to be respectful for the schools of thought that are out there, which we call methods. We try to be respectful for those methods and try to stay in harmony with those methods. Both have their value. So in terms of Flow Lab itself, if you want to stay connected, you can visit our website. We've got regular online demos. We do regular Embark trainings, or just get in touch with me if you want to know more about it. Cool.
So what? Thank you very much, Patrick. Let's all give him a Zoom round of applause. Ah, there we go. We managed to get some sound that time.
Nice.
So what questions have we got for Patrick? Just dive in and ask him what you want to know.
I'll jump in first then. The obvious question you probably expected would be, how do you design those simulations? You know, I assume you don't do them arbitrarily, and you also hinted that you don't just focus on flow. So I'd be interested in knowing as much as you can, share.
Yeah. So development of a simulation can vary between a couple of weeks to a couple of years. So we've got a couple of simulations that rolled out just like that. And then we've got a couple of simulations that have taken a very long time to develop. Now, every simulation that we do has a certain structure. If you look at how simulation is used in professional learning environments, what you do with the simulation is you create a safe space for people to have experiences that they could not have before. If you look at a flight simulator in a pilot training, with a flight simulator you can have experiences maybe in months that otherwise would take years to collect. Now, in our case, the way we structure a simulation is that typically we have a scenario that is really what we call a bad weather scenario. And in that bad weather scenario, we typically allow people to experience a way of working that is maybe not a very good way of working. It's a bad weather scenario, but does resemble enough of what they might be experiencing in their current way of working. Yeah. Now, every bad weather scenario in itself, if you're familiar with systems thinking, is driven by a set of causal loops, a set of feedback loops, a set of vicious circles or virtuous circles. So developing the scenarios goes hand in hand with developing the causal loops. For me, every simulation under the umbrella of Okaloa should allow people to experience a certain causal loop. Let me give an example. The most basic example is if you work under the policy of keeping everybody busy, the basic causal loop is if you have more WIP, if you have more work in progress, the reason why you have more work in progress is because you start too much work. And why do you start too much work? Well, because you don't want to have people sitting idle. And why are people idle? Because their work gets blocked. And why is the work getting blocked? Because you have too much work in progress. Yeah. So that's a very simple causal loop. Another one is you've got too much work in progress. That means that your lead times become too long. That means that customers start complaining. So they say this is urgent. And when customers say this is urgent, then that means that you start more work, which increases your work in progress. And so every simulation that we do does allow people to experience a certain causal loop. Now, developing that is the hard part of the simulation. Once you get the causal loops right, then from there everything flows, so to speak. Then obviously we've got the first round, the bad weather scenario, that creates friction. People get a little bit frustrated, but that's a good basis to start looking at how can we improve. And so the development process of a simulation is iteration, iteration. So we start with an idea, we try it out. Oftentimes we try to simulate something that we see with the customer. For example, one of the simulations that we've been working on quite a while has to do with, we saw some things happening in infrastructure teams, which we didn't understand. So we started to try to simulate that in the simulation. And through that, we got some insights into how infrastructure teams work, which led to a new way of, to a new simulation.
Brilliant. Any more questions for Patrick?
Instead of a question, will you take a testimonial?
I'm sure he will.
So my name is Brianna and I have your book, and I would say this is the light bulb that went off for me. on page 24, where you talk about the point of commitment, that's what really made the difference. And particularly you didn't talk too terribly much about upstream,
No.
upstream, but it fits very, very well when you're talking into a transformational change. And as an organization, I was going through that. Now my team was already forced back into Scrum, and this gave me the leverage to fight back. And I had to get some help. I didn't know how to do this on my own. So Mr. Todd Little, who you may or may not know, some of you,
Yes.
was the one who he's my mentor. I'm in Houston, Texas, and he's the one who actually helped me get the team back to being Kanban with the blessing of management. But basically, when you're talking about the bad weather events, we had to go through quite a few of those over a 3-year period to get to a point where now everybody is going through a bad weather experience. And I belong to an organization that has about 100 teams doing Agile, and I will say we are the only team weathering the bad weather now, because we had to go through those little iterations. We had to understand where's this point of where we actually commit. All that upstream makes perfect sense. So now we're not too heavily indebted to doing work that may add no value. We could clear our entire backlog, take on crisis, and work 35 hours, and not be strained or stressed like the rest of the organization. Now, it took 3 years, and it took Todd coaching me the entire time to get to that point. But I will say, please do a talk on that at some point about upstream, because
Nice.
that was a saving grace, and I'm so glad you wrote it. So, don't be shy. Please share it in the future. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Nice. Well, I was referring to upstream for this this presentation in the sense that it's another type of upstream. If you think about the Agile Manifesto, and then before the Agile Manifesto, everybody was uncovering, and everybody was creating options in terms of new ways of working. So everybody was uncovering. And then after the Agile Manifesto, that all got codified into methods. And from there on, it was downstream. It was implementing methods. So there's an analogy with what I was talking about today in terms of upstream, downstream, but then more terms of upstream in terms of discovering new ways of working, downstream implementing what we've discovered. With what you see in a team, upstream, creating your options, uncovering what you need to do, and then downstream actually doing it. So there's an analogy between those two, which I quite like, actually. But thanks for that testimonial.
I love that she had the book there. It was there. Okay, so any final questions for Patrick before we let him go and have the rest of his evening back?
Yeah, hi. It's hopefully a quick question. I just wanted to check my understanding. So, when you talked about the intuition versus the rational and codification side of things, and then intuition being, experiencing and then analyzing and then going away and thinking of your own solutions. I was wondering, how does that fit in with, like, the adaptation model where you are kind of new to something, so shuhari, where I guess someone in the shoe stage, wouldn't make. Do you expect them to kind of, be using the intuition model right at the start, or for those sort of groups, it's kind of better to just have a codified method for them to try initially, and then kind of, over time, come out with their own solution?
Yeah, and so I think that's a perfect illustration of where you need to recognize that both models have their value. So in the beginnings with Okinawa Flow Lab, I started to become a little bit ideological about experience first and theory second, about allowing people to discover their own way of thinking. But then at certain point in time, you encounter teams that are really they can't find their way. And then at certain point in times, you need to be directive, and you need to say, this is the model that now I've got good experience with that model. I can offer that model to you. And I'm not imposing that model onto you, but I can offer that model to you. And you can start practicing that. So if you start becoming idealistic or ideological, but about the place of practice, and you want to avoid that at all times. At all times, you allow people to explore their own way of thinking. Then sometimes people get lost and people don't find their way. And at certain point in times, you might need to say, okay, I know that this works. I can offer this experience to you, and then just start with this.
Okay, and on that note, it is quarter to 8. I had to double check my time there. So, you know, thanks again very much, Patrick, for an amazing talk. We really appreciate you giving up your time. So feel free to check out Okaloa, but there's lots of great other principles and thinking that sits behind this talk. And I'm sure, you know, if you wanted to reach out to Patrick about Okaloa or on Twitter or anything like that, then feel free to do so. So I just want to thank everybody again. Thanks, Patrick. Thanks, Simon, for donating the Zoom link towards us. And thanks, everybody, for coming, because it's through this community participation that we can all learn and we can all share and we can be one big old Kanban family of love. And that's what makes me really happy.